Welcome back to those who've been here before, and welcome to those who are first-time attendees at this Talking History series, a collaboration between the History Trust of South Australia and also UniSA Creative. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna people as the custodians of the lands and waters of the Adelaide region, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. I also acknowledge and respect the ongoing cultural, spiritual, physical and emotional connection that the Kaurna people have with their lands, waters and community. So welcome back, as I said. Today, this is our fourth instalment of Talking History, the collaboration between the UniSA Creative and the History Trust of South Australia. We will have 4 more for you next year. Themes, guests and inspiring puns to be determined soon. So we'll let you know about that as soon as we know. Tonight's theme is Uncanny Histories, the Invisible, the Mysterious and the Miraculous. And I think looking at our speakers tonight, I think we have some mystery. We certainly have some miraculous people. And also we have some forms of invisibility, but I'm sure we also have the total opposite of being invisible, which you will, as we've just heard over there. Now, speaking of invisible, I always make these gags when I introduce Kira. I would like to introduce our history advocate for South Australia, Dr. Kira Lindsay, who is our host with the most tonight. Thank you, Kira, and welcome.
Are we marking on this one? Is that right? Yeah? Yeah. G'day, everybody. How you going? So good to have you here. Spring has sprung and here we are, a couple of weeks from All Hallows Ween. And don't you think that tonight's theme, the uncanny, which it could also be, instead of the invisible, I'm thinking it could be the magical, the miraculous and the mysterious. Because, who doesn't like an alliteration? Okay, me, I love alliterations. So welcome all of you. I hope you got your cheese and your bickies and your wine all sorted, because you'll need provisions for this next intellectual and creative feast that we're about to embark upon together. Tonight, I would like to invite us as a group to trouble a timely problem in Australian history. But before we go there, I just want to also acknowledge that we do meet on Kaurna land. And in the spirit of the events of the last week, I suggest that we have just a brief moment of silence to acknowledge that this is unceded and sovereign land. As historians and people who have a love of history, I think we understand how important it is to recognise that unceded sovereignty and what a precious legacy and inheritance we have to be on that land. So welcome to all of you who are all very, very special guests. Some quick housekeeping, which we've just got to do. In the unlikely event of an emergency, she said, feeling like an air hostess, follow the directions of the security guard, not me. Don't panic. And the bathrooms are available at the foyer, out the door or along the corridor. I think you know where they are by now. Mobiles, please turn on to silent or aeroplane mode. And also, please be aware that tonight's event is being recorded by Channel 44 and it will air in a couple of weeks. I wonder, has anybody seen them actually on TV? Awesome, fantastic. So make sure you ask a question at the end so you can get yourself on TV. All right. So also to let you know that we haven't decided on our subjects, our speakers, our stories, our themes for next year. So if you've got a hot idea, please let us know. You can contact me directly at the History Trust of South Australia. Just type in History Avocado or History Advocate and then just give me some information on what you think would be a really good idea. What we've tried to do with the series this year, it's an old series, it's been around for 10 years, and typically it's been designed to showcase one researcher in South Australian history, but we wanted to kind of mess it up a bit and try something different, hence our glaring, bright, new look Talking History. What we wanted to do was start conversations more generally about history. That included South Australian history, but perhaps also situated South Australian research and South Australian questions within broader historical conversations and debates, happenings and events. And that is certainly what we're going to do tonight. I was really keen with this topic to trouble what I think is a very timely issue in historiography, right? The history of history. And to do so by starting with a conversation that was initiated by a group of international historians in 2016 and 2017. These historians call themselves the historians of the unbelieved. And they wanted to make the point that it's actually quite difficult for history to engage earnestly, respectfully, curiously, in an open-minded way with what they call the unbelieved. That is, things like demons, angels, divas, fairies, monsters, genies, spirits, ghosts. And the reason for that, you know, I think all of you who know your history of your historiography, is that when history, although it has ancient traditions in the fictive and the feminine and the fanciful, going back to Herodotus, who, you know, we know was known as the father of lies, but when history was trying to make its way into the academy as a discipline in the 19th century, it tried to eschew itself of those things that seemed to delegitimise it from a kind of masculine rational practice. Now that's a very short, brief simplification of the process, but it is part of a process through which I think we can see more generally there was this trend to disenchant the world and rob it of its gods, which is the way that many people describe modernity. Modernity is the disenchantment of the world and a world robbed by gods. And these historians of the unbelieved, they talk about this idea of a dogmatic secularism that informs history and makes it very hard for historical practice to engage with open-minded curiosity, with true scepticism. Not false scepticism, but true scepticism about things that people believe. The miraculous, the magical, and the mysterious. But, they say, we need to do that. We need to, one, address this disciplinary blind spot, and we also need to start to think about ways that we might actually take these ideas and principles seriously. I certainly have skin in the game on this one, because in my new book, Wild Love, which tells the story, it's a speculative biography about Adelaide Ironside, a colonial artist and mystic. I had to engage with the question of mysticism because she became famous in Europe for scrying crystal balls for Elizabeth Barrett Browning and John Ruskin. And yet no one who had ever studied Adelaide Ironside, the subject of my book, had ever touched on this topic. There it was all through her archive. But people refused to touch it. I think because they thought that no one would take them seriously if they went into an area, because of course Adelaide Ironside had to be a fraud or a madwoman to engage with these things. But what if she's not? What if she just genuinely had a legitimate experience and practice for herself? That was the premise that I started my work on, and that work drew me to the work of these historians of the unbelieved. So they implore us to move, or at least question our dogmatic secularism, to think about the way that people have believed, the way that these spiritual practices have shaped history itself, and to take that seriously, at least to treat it with an open-minded curiosity. I think this has implications not only for the way we might write the stories of women, but also all sorts of people, and including in the Australian context, how we might start to gather an even deeper and more respectful, curious engagement with First Nations notions of country, which are formed by ancestral spiritual beings. So I think this is a very topical topic for us here in Australia. I'm not saying that we have to believe, but I think that we should at least reflect on how we approach ideas of belief in history. So tonight we are going to look at the suppressed and shadowy subjects that are all too often locked out of history. And to do that we have three fantastic, magical, miraculous and mysterious speakers. Each one is going to speak for about 15 minutes. I'm going to introduce you to them one at a time, and then at the end you get your chance to ask lots of questions. So please start to exercise your own curiosity. Have lots of questions for us, because the more questions you have, the more feisty and engaging it is as a night for us. We really enjoy that. And of course, all those thousands of viewers on Channel 44 are going to get a lot more out of it too. So our first speaker tonight is the wonderful Professor Penny Edmonds, who is the Matthew Flinders Professor in History at Flinders University. She is an award-winning historian with a PhD in History from the University of Melbourne, which she combines with her own professional background in museum and heritage studies. A former ARC, Australian Research Council Future Fellow, Penny's research is distinguished by over 2 decades of creative and interdisciplinary work in the areas of Australian history, of empire, of post-colonialism, of Indigenous and settler colonial histories. I mean, she's just really impressive. She's also looked at performance, reconciliation and heritage. She's worked in the museum sector collaboratively with Indigenous staff and with all sorts of collections. I'm just starting to paraphrase now, Penny. So I think what I will finish with is that her work has been shortlisted for the University of Melbourne Ernest Scott's Prize for Best Book in Australian and New Zealand Colonial History, and she has a deep and abiding interest in awe, wonder and histories that touch on the distinctive political ecologies of the Anthropocene in Australia. All right. Please welcome her to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Kira. I just want to say it's a pleasure to be here to speak to you, and especially to speak with this panel and to speak alongside Kira, who's a dear friend of mine. So my paper today is called The Macleay Museum Bunyip, The Uncanny and Mysterious Life of an Anthropocenic Fraud. Can an object, a museum object, grab you, take hold of you and never let you go? Can an artefact seen long ago weave its way into your psyche and haunt you? In this paper, along with my panellists, I want to advocate for a more curious, critical and creative way to think about time, the environment and myth-making, and the Australian past, and prise open the cross-cultural imaginaries of settler colonialism and the environment along the way. No pressure. So tonight I'm going to discuss with you the curious Bunyip's head that is in the Macleay Museum in Sydney, part of the University of Sydney. And I'm going to begin with my own childhood story, which is true. Have any of you seen this before? My love affair with museums began when I was 7, and I have worked in museums on and off ever since. I saw a bunyip's head in a glass case, a strange, unsettling creature with a one-eyed blind stare, a cyclopic monster. I was small. I stood up on my toes to see the creature through the glass. On show was the bunyip mounted in an ornate 19th century wooden cabinet. And the typed paper label that I do remember clearly gave scientific verification. A bunyip's head, New South Wales, 1841. I actually remember the palpable shock of it, and my father said, "There's a bunyip." And I'm not sure why we were there. We didn't usually go to museums. And in my mixed childhood emotions, I believed bunyips were real. With its long jawbone wrapped in fawn-coloured fur, it was a decapitated Australian swamp dweller preserved. Yet, to me, the horrific creature looked so sad, with its sightless eye, its gaping mouth, and its cartoonish backward drooping ears. It was a creature of pathos, a gormless, goofy redhead. It was a ranger. It was a total outsider. Was I enchanted or was I haunted? I think both. So I never forgot that bunyip. And over the years, I actually became uncertain if I'd ever really seen it. It was kind of in the back of my imaginary. And 4 decades later, I kid you not, one of my friends who works in museums and Indigenous studies, Professor Lynette Russell, put the picture on her Facebook page. And I was quite shocked. My bunyip was real. So my childhood beguilement returned to this specimen, a confected creature made actually from a deformed foal's skull and skin. Yes, so the bunyip's head was a fraud. It was a clever admixture of fur, horsebone and plaster. This creature was made real and placed on display in the 1970s, both as a curio and a mythic monument to the idea of the bunyip, so powerful in the Australian colonial imagination. Yet this thing, a foal's head fraudulently mounted and made as a specimen, I want to argue, is something animal, but something more than animal. It's an object that is real and unreal, familiar and unfamiliar. It's horse and phantasm, and it's a creature that I think opens, as I went digging and digging, opens a window on the Anthropocene, the age of humans, and the changes we've wrought to the environment, to the earth, to the seas, but also to what I like to call the colonial Anthropocene, a place of rapid, dizzying change and violence too in the 19th century. So the Macleay Museum bunyip can be traced back to an era, I think, of colonial expansion in southeastern Australia that did violently dispossess Aboriginal people and wrought, as I said, rapid change. Just as this was happening, this Macleay bunyip specimen emerged as a confounding mythical figure. Yes, it was made from bones of a colonial import, the horse of European invasion and pastoralism. But it was mistakenly thought at the time by some scientists to be native and ancient. So as we know, in the 1840s, scientific men of southeastern Australia looked deeply into the megafaunal history of fossils. And actually, some of them took this confected bunyip specimen as a serious object of inquiry, and they hypothesised that it may have been a living prehistoric relic in a period which saw the first scientific discoveries of megafaunal fossils. So time is short, but I think you will all know about the myth of the bunyip that comes partly from Aboriginal lore and mythology, and it's suffice to say, glossing over the century of the long 19th century, by federation, the figure of the bunyip, drawn by Europeans from Aboriginal traditional stories, had become highly popularised. Literary studies, Ken Gelder and others have read the bunyip's swampy meanderings through Australian literature and children's books, through the lens of the mythic, the Australian post-colonial Gothic, and also through Freudian analysis. For Europeans, some scholars argue it's come to stand in for the melancholy of the Australian bush and the unspoken spectre of violent dispossession of Aboriginal peoples. Bertha the bunyip. South Australians, I give you Bertha. I'm new to South Australia. We've only been here for 4 years, but we did go to Murray Bridge. I think it was even in lockdown. Did we do that? And we visited Bertha the bunyip. She's much loved, and many of you will know her. Bertha is a bunyip from the Narrandjeri tradition of the Mulyawonk creation story, and features in South Australia's deep time, Indigenous culture, and in our popular culture. Narrandjeri children are told to never swim alone or take more fish than you can eat from the rivers. If you swim alone or you're greedy in taking too many fish, then the Mulyawonk will get you. The story actually is partly about Aboriginal law, but it's also about protecting children. So the story teaches children water safety, respect for the fish of the river and the lakes. One home of the Mulyawonk is a river cave near Tailem Bend. And there are many origins to the word bunyip, but the word bunyip also has its origins in Wemba Wemba or Wergaia language of Aboriginal people of southeastern Australia. Okay. We're now looking at Richard Owen, who is deeply interested in diprotodons, thylacoleos, and other megafaunal creatures. And we know that in the 19th century, in the early 1840s, over half a century well before this Australian creature that lurked in waterholes had reached its mythical and literary apogee at the time of Federation. We know that scientists were sending strange megafaunal fossils and other creatures to scientists in Tasmania. The Royal Society of Tasmania was one of the first scientific societies in Hobart, out of Britain, and they were also sending their finds through British circuits of empire and through scientific circles of prestige for certain scholars to look at them. The men of science in New South Wales had a question. Was the bunyip head an example of a real living creature, or was it a trace of an antediluvian monster, they asked. In fact, 2 curious specimens had been found. One was in New South Wales at the Hawkesbury. This is our bunyip, my bunyip. The other was in Victoria at the Murrumbidgee River. Now, as I said, the Hawkesbury River bunyip, 1841, is the Macleay Museum bunyip, and that was sent to scientists in Tasmania at the time. And this is the example of the foal skull and scientific drawings that were done at the time and published at the time on this curious monster/megafaunal creature. Now, Robert C. Gunn was a member of the Royal Society in Tasmania, and I think of him as a nefarious fellow. So he was very interested in megafauna. He was sending specimens around. He was also sending live thylacines around, including to the London Zoo and throughout Europe, in a very lucrative trade for him. He was also collecting Aboriginal human remains and sending them all around at the same time. So there's a vast network of objects and material culture flowing around from the Australian colonies back to Europe. Our Macleay Museum bunyip didn't actually make it all the way to Richard Owen. That's because after much examination, jump scare, that's another picture of Robert Owen. I think he's quite a sinister looking creature himself. So, you know, speaking of Halloween, if you are looking for a costume, you might like to dress up as Sir Richard Owen. He's got quite sort of sinister, poppy, sort of gothic eyes, don't you think? He apparently was a reviled person. He was not popular. He was in the middle of many scientific fights in the world of paleography at the time in Britain. So I'm talking about the 1840s, 1850s, 60s. He was quite jealous of Charles Darwin later in his life. So he was an unpleasant figure, some people felt. But our megafaunal fraud didn't make it to him. And that's because William Macleay from the Macleay Museum, who was the son of the Colonial Secretary Alexander Macleay, who was a scientist, a collector, an entomologist, examined it carefully, and he was very interested in Linnaean systems, of course, and he famously sought to end debates once and for all. So there were actually a lot of scientific papers being published over this furore of whether these bunyip skulls were actually megafauna. And he said, in Latin, natura non facit saltus. Nature does not make jumps. So he sought to end the debates once and for all. But I continue to see the bunyip skull as a rupture. There was a jump here. In fact, if we look at the skull, I think there's a biography of the Anthropocene here. If we open the skull out and think about what it meant within this curious political ecology of things moving around settler colonialism and the changing biota, actually there was a big jump happening. The monster that these scientists in Australia sought to investigate was in fact a creature of their own society's making. It was the horse of settlement, pastoralism, and of invasion. When we read about the Anthropocene and the gross changes that it wrought, it continues to bring to us in our lives, some scholars have talked about the Anthropocene as being strange and unfamiliar, or making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. The Anthropocene is also unhomely or unheimlich. No other word, Amitav Ghosh writes, comes close to expressing the strangeness of what is unfolding around us. And I believe that that was happening absolutely in the 19th century for Europeans and Aboriginal people, and animals and flora. So this then I think of as a crazy bunyip time. It's a time of change, ambivalence, disorienting time. It's bunyip time, it's an uncanny time. And I wouldn't have thought about it this way unless I'd come to the object first. If I'd gone to the scientific texts, I think I would have a different picture in my head of what was really going on. We know that Aboriginal people encountered the horse and were shocked by it. They encountered on settler colonial frontiers a new large animal they had never seen before them. It was towering, a quadruped on hooves, with fur and long legs that could bear a man on its back. Of course, they were frightened and shocked by this monster, just as Europeans were shocked by the bunyip. In Tasmania, one of the Indigenous words for men on horseback was Pakuta Tena, but it didn't mean men on horseback, it meant horseman. For them, it was men on horses were frightening hybrid creatures. So in this way, the horse entered into and transformed Indigenous culture just as the bunyip had moved into settler consciousness in curious ways. So I also, tell me when I need to finish, my dear. I think of the bunyip as a curious unfolding performance of the Anthropocene. It's an ambivalent object that crosses frontiers and confounds time and space. It's actually a biopolitical artefact, partly of invasion. It performs the confusion of the Anthropocene, and as I said, I think it choreographs a kind of bunyip time. So perhaps I'm playing with the past, as Kira says, but I think that by coming to the object first and unpacking it, rather than going to text, it took me to a very creative place, beyond the dry empiricism of capital H history, perhaps. So, thank you.
We're having a mic day, aren't we? So now we need to start thinking about the bunyip in the South Australian context a little bit more, and what the colonial uncanny may have been like in this particular context. I think that raises all sorts of questions, and we can thank Penny also for bringing in the idea of monsters, another M word that fits in with our magical, miraculous, and are mysterious. And the wonderful thing about the word monster, I remember learning in cultural studies year 2 or something like that, was that it can be, shares the root with the word demonstrate, and that monsters demonstrate otherness. And I think, what we see with the bunyip is an expression of otherness and the uncanny, of frauds and forgers, of improvisers and imposters, which was so much a part of that colonial era as people were trying to make sense of the world in this makeshift kind of context. But they were also trying to make meaning. And our next speaker, Peter Cahalan, is going to talk about one particular woman who made a contribution to meaning making. So it's a great delight that we have Peter here with us tonight. After training as a teacher, Peter undertook a PhD in British history at the Canadian University, where he developed his lifelong commitment to South Australian history. So he had to go to Canada to find out how good South Australia was. He became founding director of the Constitutional Museum of South Australia in 1978 and the very first CEO of the History Trust in 1981. Impressive, Peter. Thank you for that, by the way. During his time at the History Trust, he worked closely with a number of other agencies, including the Tourism Commission, to ensure that historical projects were at the fore in a range of major celebratory events ranging over the next 2 decades. Peter moved from the History Trust to the SA Tourism Commission in 2000, and there he undertook a range of jobs and managing interpretive projects, serving as the regional manager for the state's economy's 2 largest regions, the Flinders Ranges and Outback and the Fleurieu Peninsula. He retired in 2021, but not really, and continues to work part-time in history and as a trustee of the National Railway Museum, which is awesome. If you haven't been there, go there now. Well, not right now, but on the weekend or soon. And he's also an advisory board of the Mary MacKillop Museum in Kensington, which is also fabulous. And tonight he's going to explore the question of, so what is uncanny about a nun?
If you didn't pop yourself straight on your seat, you might have noticed that there's either a small picture of Mary MacKillop or a long elongated bookmark. They're not there because I'm trying to convert you to Catholicism, although, just to know my audience, how many of you have a Catholic background here? Right, okay, so you know that when I'm talking the word habit, I'm not talking about a custom, I'm talking about a uniform, all right? Anyway, so no, I panicked because I thought I missed the deadline for the PowerPoint. So I thought, what do I do? So I rushed out to the Mary MacKillop Museum, thinking I'd get a whole lot of holy pictures. The trouble was that the cost of being a Catholic these days has risen enormously, and the holy pictures are very expensive. So only about 20 of you have got a holy picture. Hang on to them; they're quite valuable, though I did get a discount. And the other thing is that I do like, though, the lovely bookmark, because I think it catches the joy of Mary MacKillop as well as the seriousness that I'm going to talk about. So, when asked to add Mary MacKillop to this panel on Uncanny Histories, I wondered why. After all, my first encounter with MacKillop was as supervisor of a PhD of the early history of the Sisters of St. Joseph, or Joeys. Whenever Sister Marie Fole, or Mari, I hate that name, I can never remember which way it goes, referred to as Mary, I ruthlessly told her to call her MacKillop. My training as a secular historian prevailed over any Catholic piety in me. Perhaps sainthood is seen as part of another mysterious world, a bit weird perhaps, and which is why I've been invited. But to go broader first, Australia's most successful museum, one might argue, I should get up the first slide, shouldn't I? Is that going to work? No, that's right. That's me all over. Want to give me a hand? I'll just sort of see if I can get the entry slide up. I'm just pushing It's all right. There we go. That's all right. Okay. Australia's most successful museum, one might argue, is the Australian War Memorial, because it's a shrine as well as an interpretive, educational, storytelling place. My own museum experience, coming into it as a young humanist historian and a Catholic in 1978, was that religious polarities, the divine as transcendence and the divine as immanence, still play actively in the way history is interpreted. The trope for that is the museum a temple guarded tightly by its priests, art galleries tend to be that, or the forum where ideas and stories are shared by the folk. Is culture a higher sphere, or is it everywhere and part of collective experience? Is God up there or quite close at hand? Are you cultured if you love opera and despise football, but a Philistine if you love football and dislike opera? A note to the side here, whatever the democratic aspirations of culture workers, the hierarchical up-down model, culture's up there, Philistinism is down here, is harder wired into us than the than the more embracing, immanent version that history is everywhere and part of ordinary life, for example. Anyway, visitors to the Mary MacKillop Museum, can you hear me, by the way? Yep. In Kensington and other MacKillop centres very often are coming for quite explicitly religious and pilgrimage reasons, and so they make the meaning, in other words. But for the non-religious visitor, these shrinal museums will be encountered as pretty normal interpretive experiences. Kensington, for example, doesn't explore the intangible of the miracles needed for Mary MacKillop to be considered finally for canonisation. Its stuff is the history of how a young woman was followed by generations of young women who accepted really tough lives. The mystery for me as a modern Catholic, admittedly one nurtured in a 1950s church not all that different from the generations of earlier Josephites, is why they joined and why they stayed. But these are no different questions from that which one might apply to any group of humans. So for me, the Mary MacKillop Museum is one where I, mainly, experienced the usual rational, quote-unquote, questions which historians would ask in any other museum. So is there anything uncanny about the story of Mary MacKillop and the Josephites? Well, first, the two miracles the Church requires before canonising someone. In Mary's case, the seemingly miraculous recoveries of two women in 1961, leukaemia, and 1993, lung cancer. If miracles are uncanny things, all I can say is that Italian culture is a hell of a lot uncannier than ours. Pope Francis canonised 7 Italians just last year. We managed just one in a couple of centuries of invasion. Got to pick up our game, Aussies. Are there any people with Italian heritage here tonight? Got Italian blood? Lift your game, guys. We need you. We've got to get another saint soon. Secondly, the mystery of the early success of the order, which Mary created in 1866 with her mentor, Father Julian Woods, is to me somewhat mysterious. By 1871, when the Josephites met their first big crisis, in only 5 years, over 110 women, generally quite young, had joined up. Now, the Catholic population of South Australia then was about 18,000 people. That's somewhere between my hometown of Port Pirie and the population of Whyalla today. So, were 110 young women in one of those towns today to flock to a life wearing rough clothing and begging around the streets to sustain themselves and their teaching and social work, we'd be yelling cult. As a South Australian, I can't say words well, so cult. I'll try again. Okay, to this day, it remains mysterious to me as to what was going on there. It's a phenomenon. And by the way, about that cult remark, the crisis of 1871, the excommunication of Mary, and the banning of the order for a few months was a complex affair. It certainly included a vendetta by Father Horan, furious that MacKillop had called out a fellow Franciscan for a sexual abuse in Kapunda. I gather, by the way, that Mary has been adopted informally as a patron saint of abuse victims these days. But the clergy were also concerned at the impact on the Catholic brand of the Josephites' behaviour, and I'll speak about that in a moment. Anyway, after the crisis was over, several dozen women didn't come back. It really was a tough life, they realised that, and yet, amazingly, the great majority did return. Whatever the romance of their first joining, this second time round, they knew what they were in for. This is what remains mysterious to me. So here's Mary over the years. Let's hope this works. How do you make it work, Kira?
Wrong way.
Wrong way. Right, there we go. There we go, got it now. There's her young, about 20. There's her a bit later. There's her a bit later again. There's her nearing the end. And there's my favourite photograph of her. You can see her intelligence and her, can't you, just shining from that photograph. Born in 1842 in Melbourne, she was pretty knocked around by the time she died in 1909. She suffered from endometriosis for a start. The doctors prescribed her medicinal brandy, and the rumour that she was an alcoholic held up her canonisation for a good 50 years. The accusation was unfounded, and I can attest to that. As a sickly youngster in the 1950s, I was given stout to build me up, sherry to give me an appetite, and brandy as medicine. And yet I stand here today as only a moderate occasional drinker. Is that a miracle? More generally, she's had a harsh life for herself and her parents. Let's just look at the habit, the costume. A man designed it, by the way. I haven't got a photograph of it, but that's the description. You can read it for yourself. A man designed it, Tennyson Woods. What an abomination. You know, their life was tough enough, yet he made sure their outfit was terrible to wear. Yet Josephites wore versions of it, adapted admittedly to be kinder to them until 1969, a full century. And then the men generally didn't help. This photograph fascinates me. I think it must be one of the most important photographs in South Australian Catholic history. It's Bishop Shield, the excommunicator, and his priests in 1867. In it, there are friends of hers. Third from the left, at the back is Julian Tennyson Woods. Bitter enemies, the guy on the left, and some who came and went. But the great enemy is there, on the left, Christopher Reynolds. At first a friend, he turned on Mary when he became the next bishop of Adelaide in 1873. Now, I'm no fan of the epistolary novel, you know, the ones where the story is told as a series of letters between the characters. But if you want a story, a riveting story, where the villain is a conniving, bullying, lying, cowardly bastard, and by the way, the editor, when I was doing spell check today, said, do you really want to use that word? It might offend people. Then get a copy of Mary MacKillop in Challenging Times, 1883 to 1899, a collection of letters edited by Sheila McCreenell. It's just amazing. Reynolds drove Mary from Adelaide to exile in Sydney in 1883. The local Joeys, with long memories of the event, claim wryly that the first South Australian head office to become a branch office was theirs, way back in 1883. Up yours, Christopher Reynolds. There were other men too, local hierarchs elsewhere, but interestingly, Rome, the dreaded Vatican, backed her against the local bishops throughout. The underlying fight was always about who ran the show. Irish-born bishops were used to having authority over the generally large and stable convents in the diocese. Mary fought for central governance of the order, that is, where the elected women leaders ran their own show, and Rome supported her, which, by the way, didn't stop the blokes from having a good go every so often. So, hard life, hard politics, and harsh living. The Joeys arguably did it harder than other religious orders, and that's because MacKillop and Tennyson Woods created a paradigm which was radically different and very adapted to Australian conditions. Traditionally, women's religious orders had two layers. There were the lady or choir nuns, generally better educated, and then there were the lay sisters. They were the housekeepers, the servants. So this meant that when the Dominicans arrived in Adelaide in 1868, they came as a group of 7. And until the 1960s, in the Cabra Chapel, the order of seating was sisters by order of seniority, novices, and at the back, the lay sisters, no matter how long they've been there. The Josephites totally abolished that distinction, and this meant they were free to go out in units as small as 2, and this meant in turn that they could respond quickly to needs and demands, often set by their siblings. They were, by their bishops, they were in a way the Catholic equivalent of the adaptive Methodist response to frontier conditions, where lay preachers got things started right away, while at the other end the Anglicans, used to their squire managing things back home, were often slower. The Joeys didn't wait. They'd hop to when a new town was starting, and they'd get out of it if the need wasn't there. There's my previous slide, I should say. Amazing how, by the way, in about 2 years they created 21 schools. Just extraordinary growth. And then here's what they did. Not only when they started, but notice how they got out. They might last 2 years in the town, like Blimman, Saltire, that Saltire up in the Pitcherichi Pass, just 2 years while the guys were building the railway through the pass, and then when it finished, they moved on. That's all great and actually quite inspiring. If I think of a great Josephite characteristics, it's adaptability. Another is a certain humility. They flourished in those early days because the educational barriers were lower than for other orders. The Joeys included highly educated founders, but they drew in young working class and rural women with often fairly basic schooling. And so they didn't have the cachet of the Dominicans and the Mercies and the Loreto nuns, yet they became the most prolific teachers of young South Australian Catholics. But the regime was indeed hard. Up early to pray, cook all meals, teach all day, pray, do all the housekeeping. The lodgings often primitive and the food basic and even sparse. Yet they kept on coming right up until around the 1960s, after which recruitment tailed off. Now to head back to Mary MacKillop herself. How am I going for time? Okay. She remains for me as enigmatic as any other great historical figure, but no more so. She was highly intelligent, as the letters show, a great communicator, as the letters show. She was effective at winning influential backers, like the wealthy Joanna Barr-Smith, who was a lifelong friend and correspondent. She inspired almost all, though not all, of her sisters. She was forgiving of her foes. She was persistent against the odds and indeed stubborn. One of the reasons the Irish clergy here went for her in 1871 was to do with aspiration. She took a pragmatic view, as she saw it, teach the poor the basic skills. For that reason, she opposed the teaching of music and languages. She had to give in on music. When they realised they couldn't survive by begging, the Joeys earned their way as the great piano teachers of country South Australia. But she remained adamant about languages, and a year or so before her death in 1909, complained about some silly sister in New Zealand who was teaching French. Now, this clashed entirely with the priest's determination that colonial Irish would make their way up the social ladder. No replica of the bitter Irish experience for them. This was to be a land of opportunity, and that meant having accomplishments. And who can say that they were wrong? The myth of excommunication is one where women, for once, won the battle for history. Good women victimised by nasty men. It was just a bit more complex than that. Mary was not, by the way, great with finances. She was too ready to accept new challenges, which included taking the order to Queensland and New South Wales in very short order, and not long after to New Zealand, the first of other later overseas plantations, including in Peru, Timor and Scotland. She built up significant debts at times, as well as taking the resilience of her followers, taxing the resilience of her followers. It was all too much, really, but she was helped by a cohort of other women with leaderly and administrative abilities that kept things going. So in the event, was she uncanny? Well, how many women, by the way, they kept coming, and you can see that they're a bit older in the later picture, and they've got nicer clothes, but my question is, how many women, aged 24, start a business which lasts 150 years and goes international? I think she should be a patron, by the way, for every women's business network in Adelaide. So, pretty amazing, I think. Mary has had plenty of attention, but those hundreds and hundreds of women who followed her into the order across Australasia are a big story yet to be fully explored. Perhaps someone here tonight is up for that challenge. If you want to do some initial digging, here's the plug. The Mary MacKillop Museum and Precinct, which includes the original chapel she built and lived above, at Kensington is well worth a visit. And there are mysteries in the story of Mary and the Josephites, but no more than for any other topic tackled by your average secular historian. So I wonder, did I accept my invitation to join this panel on false pretences? And finally, just an additional ad, here's how she would have voted in the referendum, but anyway.
Thanks, Peter. So when you find yourself in times of trouble, had to do it. Peter, thank you very much for introducing those kind of questions about culture and cult and what it is that drives people, how faith can have that animating effect on a person's life, so that they will do these extraordinary things that take them out of the everyday into worlds where they live sacrifice, but it is a form of service and meaning. And I think that there's a lot in there that is mysterious, a part of the human condition that we can dwell on. The other thing, Peter, that you brought up, you gave us another M, music, which I think is also a part of the uncanny exploration. You know, in a couple of weeks' time, we'll have All Hallows Ween. And yes, this has been well and truly Americanised in the Australian context, but it has such an ancient tradition, a time when the veil between the worlds was thin enough for all those areas of the unbelieved to be felt and become believed, or at least experienced by people from the past. So before I was talking about a world that has been disenchanted, that has lost its gods, and I think All Hallows Ween is an opportunity to imagine how we might re-enchant the world and bring those things back into our sphere. But the other idea I want to just put into our thoughts is this idea of the music of the spheres, of the cosmos. And certainly the woman that I've just written my biography about believed in the idea, as many early 19th century romantics did, of universal intelligence, that everything was innately interconnected. The world was one, that we were part of the one. And I believe that these are the sort of questions that our next speaker might be exploring in her own work, which is concerned with another 19th century woman who, like my woman, Adelaide Ironside, also had a love of Australian flowers. Dr. Jessica White, a university senior lecturer, is also the author of the award-winning A Curious Intimacy and Entitlement, and a hybrid memoir about deafness entitled Hearing Maud, which won the 2020 Michael Couch Award for a debut work of biography and was shortlisted for 4 other national awards, including the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Non-Fiction. Jessica has received funding from the Australian Research Council, the Australian Council of the Arts, the Arts Queensland and Arts South Australia, and has undertaken national and international residencies and fellowships. We're very lucky to have her here at the moment, in fact, because she's in the middle of writing her book and is needing time to do so. But we get her. She was the 2020-2021 Juncture Fellow of the Sydney Review of Books, and in 2022-23 the Arts Leader for the Australian Council of the Arts. Jess is currently Senior Lecturer in Creative Writing at the University of South Australia, and her eco-biography of the 19th century Western Australian botanist, Georgiana Molloy, will be published in January 2025. So, please welcome Jess to talk about her experiences of the ecological past, present and future.
Thank you, Kira, for that very lovely introduction, and thank you to the 2 wonderful speakers who've gone before me. There are a couple of resonances in my paper with what you've both been talking about. So I acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from unceded Kaurna country, and I acknowledge Kaurna people's continuing care, custodianship and storytelling over thousands of years. I also acknowledge the custodians of the country, which has given rise to the book that I'm writing, the Wardundee Noongar people of southwest Western Australia. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly in the light of events of the last few days. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about my work in progress, The Miniature and the Momentous, which is an eco-biography of Georgiana Molloy, where a biography details the events of a person's life, an eco-biography focuses on the way an environment shapes a person's sense of self. I'll explain that in order to show how plants changed Georgiana's life and how they can change, and in turn, how they can change ours, I need to move beyond history and to draw on my skills in literary analysis and creative writing. So a little bit about Georgiana first. This is the only portrait that we have of hers, which was painted before she left Australia in 1829. So she was born in Carlisle in 1805, and she moved to this giant pile, Crosby, in 1808 when she was 3. And her father was very wealthy. He married into money, but he died in 1819 when he fell off his horse. And then he left behind debts of £11,000, 5 children, and a widow with no means of supporting them. But at the back of that house, which I visited in 2017, there's a walled garden, and that's where Georgiana learned her first lessons about gardening and about plants, as was expected of a young girl who was training to become a lady. So as Georgiana grew up, her family had to try and make ends meet, and her mother moved the family to Rugby for the son's education. But Georgiana's sister was an alcoholic, and mother sided with the sister, and so Georgiana couldn't cope, and she moved to Scotland to stay with her friends, the Dunlops, who lived east of Glasgow. Pictures. So I was there in 2017, and earlier this year I had to get a sense of what the environment was like so that I could see what Georgiana was seeing when she moved to Australia. So she got to 24, which is getting on a bit for a woman of that time, and her options were narrowing. It was either go back to mum and the sister and this fraught family life, or it was marrying a man who was very interested in her, and that was John Malloy. And he was a soldier who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, and he wanted to go to southwest Western Australia, where the colony of Swan River was just starting up. So Georgiana was like, okay, I'm going to marry this man, and moved to the other side of the world. And here's just another picture of Scotland before we move on. So the traditional custodians of the southwest are the Noongar people, and their budja, or their country, runs from Geraldton down to Esperance. It's a little corner in southwest Western Australia. And the custodians of the particular area I'm writing about are the Wurundjeri Noongar people. They're saltwater people. The British started colonising the area in 1827, and the Malloys arrived in Fremantle in 1830. And all the land in that area was taken, so they sailed south to Augusta, right down the tip of Western Australia. But Georgiana had a terrible start. She got pregnant on the ship, but there was no nourishment. And so 2 weeks after she arrived in a tent in pouring rain, she gave birth to her first child. And then over the course of 10 days, the baby died because it wasn't well. So can you imagine, the first time you turn up in Australia, you have a baby and your baby dies. That's your start to life in Australia. It was pretty traumatic. And so 2 years after 2.5 years after she arrived, she wrote this letter to her sister, Elizabeth, and she said, "This is certainly a beautiful place, but were it not for the domestic charms, the eye of the emigrant would soon weary of the unbounded limits of thickly clothed dark green forests where nothing can be described to feast the imagination." So you can see from those words that there's a sense of enclosure. The fact that the trees are thickly clothed suggests she can't take a step back and get a vantage point. She's trapped. And you can see, if you look back to all this water and all this space, how different it is to the area that she's moved to. And then in 1836, she received a request from Captain James Mangles, who was cousin to the wife of the Governor of Perth at that time, or Swan River, to collect Australian seeds and specimens, because Australian flora was all the rage. It was very exciting at this time. But Georgiana brushed him off. She's like, too busy, got too much housework to do. But so by that stage, she had 2 little girls and a little boy. But in 1837, the boy, who was 19 months old, wandered off into an uncovered well, and he fell into the well and he drowned. And Georgiana then experienced what she described as a dangerous illness in her letters, and I take that to mean a nervous breakdown. So in order to take her mind from her grief in this traumatic event, she said, okay, I'm going to start collecting seeds for Mangles, and she went out to the bush every day. And when that happened, she experienced a transformation in the way that she saw the plants. Where once they were this indistinguishable mass, now she could focus on the plants individually and describe them in her letters to Mangles. So she was doing science through the act of observation and deduction, But what I've found is that there's 3 biographies published about her, and none of them talk about her as a scientist, and none of them talk about her as a writer. So these are the letters that she wrote. The person at the other end paid the postage, so in order to save paper, and there was hardly any paper in the colony at that time anyway, they wrote one way and then they turned it 90 degrees and wrote over the top. So I paid my research assistants to transcribe them. Awful. Okay, and this is a sample of some of her flowers, and that is from the Cambridge Herbarium. There's also a collection in Kew Gardens, and it says Bass River Mrs. Malloy. So she was the one who collected them and sent them to Mangles, who sent them to his mates, and they got named. They got the credit for naming the plants. And down the bottom it says T. Mangalese. So it's a mulla mulla, and that's the Noongar name, and then the T is the name that it was before this Latin name, the Tilus mangalese, and then pom-poms is a common name, but it was named for Mangles, who got the specimen from Georgiana, and I'll come back to that naming thing at the end. So these are the 3 biographies. We've got Alexandra Hasluck's Portrait with Background, published in 1955 with Oxford University Press, republished by Fremantle University Press, I think in 2000. William Lynes's An All-Consuming Passion, Origins, Modernity and the Australian Life of Georgiana Malloy, that's published in 1996. And then Bernice Barry's The Mind That Shines, self-published in 2015, and then picked up and republished by Pan Macmillan. So each of these books are cradle-to-grave biographies. They present the facts of Georgiana's life in a linear time frame. But do they focus on how plants changed her life? And I think to a degree they do, but mostly it's on this linear presentation. So how in my book do I show the importance of plants to Malloy's history and how they changed her life? Or how can I bring those dry pressed specimens into being for a reader? So I'm using a number of techniques, but I'm just going to talk now about 2. One is literary analysis, which highlights the way that Georgiana mobilised language in her letters to Mangles, and the other one is creative writing. So very early on in this project, which has been going for 25 years now, I'm very sick of it, I noticed that the letters that Georgiana wrote to her family and friends were vastly different to those that she wrote to Mangles. So in 1833, she wrote to her friend Helen Story in Scotland. I have all the clothes to put away from the wash, baby to put to bed, make tea and drink it without milk as they shot our cow for a trespass, read prayers and go to bed, besides sending off this table full of letters. I wish I had you here to help me. What golden dreams we used to have about you coming to stay with me. How would you like to be 3 years in a place without a female of your own rank to speak to or to be with you, whatever happened? So that was 3 years after she arrived. She's not having a great time. And then she began corresponding with Mangles in 1837, and the first letter was quite short, and she said, quote, "As all my former pursuits have necessarily been thrown aside by the peremptory demands of my personal attention to my children and domestic drudgery, I fear it will long ere I can make an adequate return in Australian production." So she's saying, I've just got too much housework to do. And I've got to look after my kids. And so she was born a lady. She didn't ever expect to have this life when she turned up in Australia. But as I mentioned, in November of that year, her son died, and Georgiana recounted that event in great detail to Mangles, which is unusual. She's writing about a very personal event to a stranger. And then she started describing her collecting efforts. And what is clear from their letters is that she found pleasure not only in the activity of collecting, but also in the process of writing about flowers. And in her letters, she uses metaphor and she uses simile. She uses character, so she's portraying herself as this very feminine character, and she's laying on the charm very thickly. So I'm going to show you a passage. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. And she's talking about a book which Mangles published about growing plants in the city, because he was a London gardener. I'm not going to read it all out because of time. I'm just going to read out this highlight. So she's asked, she's saying that she wished in this book she had a photo, a frontispiece of Mangles. So she didn't have that photo. I found that on the internet. She said, I wish there was a frontispiece so I can see face to face the person whom fate has so capriciously veiled from sight. but made so instrumental in bestowing kindness and gratification at so remote a part of the globe. Our acquaintance is both singular and tantalising and somewhat melancholy to me, my dear sir, to reflect on. We shall never meet in this life. We may mutually smooth and cheer the rugged path in this world's existence, even in its brightest condition, by strewing flowers in our way, but we never can converse with each other. And I'm sincere when I say I never met with anyone who so perfectly called forth and can sympathise with me in my prevailing passion for flowers. So here, her reference to the capricious fate and to a veil gestures to secrecy and to something hidden, and it's reinforced by that word tantalising. And meanwhile, she goes completely over the top by talking about strewing flowers, and she ends with a reference to passion. So who wouldn't want a letter like that in their lives? And here's just a couple more. Oh, sorry, that's the book that Mangles wrote. Here's a couple more quotes. She said to him, I've discovered a plant I've been almost panting for, a small, neat white blossom on a furze-looking bush. Furze means gorse. And then she got quite sick at one point, and her sister was staying. And she's talking about how when she was ill and feverish, her sister declares that 3 times out of 4, when she came to her bedside, she called out, oh, poor Captain Mangles, I cannot go on with his collection, and the seeds of Niotsia floribunda will all be shed. So there's clearly something going on in these letters, and I was trying to work out why. She's obviously flirting with him through her language and her anecdotes, and this is the conclusion I came to. She said to him, I should like nothing better than to kindle a fire and stay all night, as I should be ready for my work early in the morning without again coming so far or affecting any collection. She wants to go out in the bush and stay in the bush. And then this. When I sally forth, either on foot or horseback, I feel quite elastic in mind and step. I feel I am quite at my own work, the real cause that enticed me out to Swan River. So what she's saying is that collecting has changed her life. The plants have given her a sense of purpose, provided her with intellectual engagement, and given her a chance to connect with the life she left behind in England and Scotland. And so what I'm trying to show by analysing these letters is like she's describing how plants changed her life and how by extension they can change our lives too. But it's not just Georgiana's history that I'm writing, it's also the history of the plants in Western Australia. So this area is a biodiversity hotspot, which means it has a huge number of endemic species. That means they only grow in that area, and they're highly threatened by clearing for agriculture and housing and by mining, and there's also climate change. And because there's fewer trees, there's less water, and the species are kind of thinning. So there's fewer black cockatoos because all their homes have been cut down. So what I'm trying to show is that in looking back, we can see how colonisation has had an incredible impact on the human and non-human inhabitants of Western Australia, and that creative writing has the capacity to convey this in urgent and effective ways. And this plant here is Boronia molloyei, and it's the only plant that was named after Georgiana. Most of the other plants were given names after Mangles or John Lindley, who was his friend. He gave his specimens to Lindley and he named them after himself. So this plant was given her the name in the 1970s posthumously. So I'm just going to close with a brief reading in the hope that this is going to demonstrate what I'm talking about in terms of plant liveliness and plant agency and the way plants can transform us. It's only a few minutes. Okay. At first glance, they look like squat palms sprouting from the soil by the shore, except that the climate in the southwest is not tropical. In the cold season of Makuru, the winds blow in from the sea, rippling the waters of what is now called Flinders Bay, biting exposed skin and crawling under wooden jumpers. It's the same season that the whales pass by, way out in the distance, beyond the foamy caps. They've been going that way for so long that they've changed shape and size. They're much smaller than they used to be. Georgiana thought they were palms too, but they are in fact cycads, ancient plants that existed before the dinosaurs. Records of their ancestors have been found in fossils stretching back approximately 280 million years. If you stand beside them and stretch out a hand, running your finger pads over their thin leaves, you'll find them hard, a little spiky, impenetrable, and tough. They've come from a time when this area was flooded with trees, then water, then ice. Sometimes, walking on the cliffs, you might come across a fossilised circle, and if you pick up the stone, you catch a whiff of pine, old as millennia. Alongside mosses, horsetail ferns, conifers, ginkgos and cycads, these plants have a connection with ecosystems of the deep past. When they bloom, their centres cluster with red, fleshy fruit, a cone-shaped heart held in a spiky hand. There's some evidence to suggest they were eaten by the megafauna who roamed the area before an asteroid or meteor rammed into the Earth, creating an impact winter. They'd survived 4 extinction events prior to this. The macrozemia, as they would come to be known, stood by the shore for millennia, their seeds plucked, fermented and eaten by Noongar people. Their slow-growing fronds were brushed by breezes from the bay or stronger winds during storms that chopped up the water and shoved it against the shore. Although they did not see a ship pulling into the bay, nor a smaller craft leaving the ship for the shore, they might have registered the new pathogens that drifted along in their air. They would have sensed the disturbance in the soil as the trees were cut down and fellow species uprooted. Eventually, there was no place for the macrozemia seeds to grow in this spot. All the plants along the shore were tugged up and replaced with grass, then tarmac. The macrozemia were left to sprout in the forests, and they were tough and hardy plants, but so many of their companions, relying on small spots of ecosystem, were destroyed. And all this happened because of the people in the boats who travelled from the Swan to Augusta, and it happened fast. In the comparison to the time before the dinosaurs, it was as fast as a meteor. So I'm going to end there. I'm hoping that by showing the longevity of the plants in the area and using them as witnesses, I'm trying to show how fast the humans are destroying the ecosystems, and that we need to look to the past in order to save the plants of the future. Because if the plants die, we die too. So I'll end on that happy note. Thank you.
I really love Jess's work and the way that she captures through Georgiana's communion with the flowers this idea of meditation, another M word. And John Ruskin, who taught Adelaide Ironside, the woman I've been writing about, to paint, well, rather she had already painted over 40 Australian wildflowers by the time she got to England, but Ruskin decided that she needed to start all over again and drawing all over again. But he did say, and he said about her, I can't separate the sense from the nonsense in you. And I actually like the idea that in this seminar, we're actually talking about bringing the sense and the nonsense back together, the irrational and the irrational in our conversation. Ruskin, however, said one thing, many things that are good, but this one I particularly love. I think it connects with Jess. He said, I don't teach you to look at nature so that you can paint. I teach painting so that you can look at nature. And I think that's kind of what you've been talking, this is what I feel that you're saying in your book, Jess, is how can we look at things deeply and in a way that invites communion as well. So thank you for that. And the idea of the elastic in mind too. So all three of our speakers today, in their different ways, have taken us into the Australian bush and invited us to have an experience of the uncanny. All three of our speakers have also situated us in the 1840s, albeit in very different ways. Science has touched through these three talks in different ways too. The conversation has sometimes been fraught and tense and full of its failings, but it's also been something that has brought opportunity for women too. So those are some themic connections that I was surprised and delighted to see in there, and I guess it gets us thinking about. Thanks, Jess. One of the things that those historians of the unbelieved said that I thought was really interesting as a provocation for our speakers and for you was that they said human experience is incredibly rich and multidimensional. It involves mysterious elements of our own intuition and imagination that we don't quite understand, embodied experience, emotional experiences. And they said, when we don't take that seriously in the experiences of the past, we shortchange not only the past, but also our present. So my question for each of our panellists in different ways would be, what is one element of the work that you've been doing that you feel brings something to the fore that has perhaps been previously suppressed or shadowed? Or something that you think makes sure that we don't shortchange the past in your own work? Is that too much of a doozy? Jess, you look like you've actually got something to say. Just breathe it. Just go.
Working? Does that sound right? Yeah, okay, cool. Well, what got me hooked on this book, well, before I even got hooked on the book, was a book of 19th century letters called The Letters of Rachel Henning. And she was a woman in New South Wales in the 19th century, and she published these letters in, I think it was the Bulletin, and later they published in a book, and Norman Lindsay did the illustrations for them. And she talks about riding her horse and camping out under the stars, and it was a complete revelation to me that women in the 19th century could have fun. They could go out and wide-ranging and in the bush and on wide-ranging excursions and physically present in the bush. They weren't just cloistered in a living room. Mm-hmm. And then I came across Georgiana. I was like, holy crap, she's out in the bush. She wants to stay out in the bush, but she was contained to the house because of her kids, so she couldn't leave. And so a lot of stories about exploration go from the coast to the interior, and they're very linear, but because she was a woman, she's tied to house, the stories are all circular, and she was able to focus more deeply on what was around her because she was confined. So there's this sense of, I get from her letters, of longing to move out into the bush beyond the house, but because she couldn't, all that intensity was transferred to the circle around her house. So I was surprised at how physical those women were. Yeah.
And how the bush became a place for the expression of that passion and a place to channel it. Fantastic. Penny.
Interesting question, yes. I think the bunyip head obviously captured me as a child and then came kind of swinging back to me as an adult, and I saw it in a very different way. But I think the other thing as myself now is thinking about the bunyip head as something that is full of material vibrancy, and it was a thing that was found in the mud in the Hawkesbury River that is made of horse bone and hair and mud, but it's also a foreign creature that has arrived there. And I think thinking about those material histories are things that sometimes we forget. We're very text-based. I love theory, but I think that deep materiality of the environment and change and ecosystem, which touches on your work too, is something that can be a revelation. And I think, I do get quite obsessed sometimes with things, and I think I sort of took it quite far, but, it's perhaps some more proper scholars would say too far. But I think the bunyip head still engages me for various reasons because of that vibrant materiality that we can explore.
I love the fact also that there's a hoaxer in this story who thought it was a bit of a, let's have a joke at the science fellas by either helping to construct this thing or by taking it and sending it to Sydney. And, there must have been some people thinking this was a great lark. And just that part of the Australian bush story, too, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the bunyip head is a ruse. It's a conceit. It is a fake. And when I saw it as a child, and I've been trying to work out exactly where I saw it. I think we must have been in the old Nicholson Museum, which doesn't really, I'm not sure if it exists anymore. I think it's now part of the Chow Chuck Wing massive sort of conglomeration of a number of museums that have now been brought together. But in my mind's eye, I was somewhere that was 19th century looking at it. Yes.
And how many people wanted that bunyip to be real when they first saw the picture of it? Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, that sense? And how many were sure, with the first moment they saw it, that it was just a made-up thing? Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, even in that answer, we get the sense of how we engage with the mysterious in different ways, the extent to which we bring our scepticism into these kind of conversations. Peter, what about Mary MacKillop and all those women going out into the bush? What do you think is going on there? You asked that question of that you said that to me is the really miraculous thing, the really mysterious thing. Yes. What's going on?
Well, actually, I was going to say that the discussion actually opened up a new question for me. They were in the bush, but were they actually in the bush? They were dealing with towns like Orroroo and Peterborough. They were living such hard lives. I wonder whether they ever got a chance much to get out. There is a lovely photograph from Port Lincoln around about 1927 of them hopping on a boat. One of the fishermen was taking the kids and them out in the boat. The interesting thing is that you can see the kids, but all you see is the back of the sisters. So they still remain mysterious in that way. But I was thinking about, for me, the whole thing about the Josephites is the humility and the way in which they fall under the radar in many ways. So Mary MacKillop gets a lot of attention, but the rest of them haven't got much. Even one of the things about them, they said to me a couple of years ago, was that they don't get much in the way of bequests from old scholars. Very simple reason is they taught the primary school kids. And then the Jesuits and the Dominicans, the Mercies, got the senior school kids. And of course, when you're an old scholar, you're an old scholar of the high school. So, the Jesuits get lots of money, but the poor old Joeys don't get much at all. So I would love to see the Josephites spread across, not in South Australia, but Australia, and what effect they had on those communities, but also why they did it and how they did it and who left the order and who didn't, because some did. I'd love to see that explored more. So are there any PhD student aspirations here, despite your ages? No? Right.
Well, we'll open the floor for a couple of questions. If anyone's got a question, this is your time to get yourself on Channel 44. Just put up your hand and the microphone will come to you over there, just up the back. Thank you. Feel free to say your name and introduce yourself. G'day.
G'day. My name's Keith, and thank you very much for what you've put on tonight. And this is addressed to Penny, but possibly only Peter, being of a different era, will understand. But it is another M word. You recall that photograph of Mr. Owen, and you mentioned that he looked quite intimidating, perhaps. Well, there was a cult, again, you can correct me on the pronunciation there, Peter, but there was a cult film star in the 70s, and his name was Marty Feldman. Now, didn't Mr. Owen look like Marty Feldman? Uncannily so.
Uncannily so, I like it.
I was trying to look around at the men in the room to see whether anyone was going to be offended by the comments that were being made about that.
Thank you.
Can I just say, actually, in looking at those photos, I wonder if he perhaps had some thyroidism or, that maybe he was actually really unwell. I'm not sure, but he looks quite gothic at the same time.
And Dickensian, he looks like one of those bone turners.
He does.
Yeah.
Do you know Marty Feldman, Penny?
No, I don't.
No. I do.
Well, the thyroid.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Any other questions? Which that was really a statement, wasn't it? Come on, who's got a question? Yes. A question. Hang on.
The first hand up here.
Great. Now you're warming up. Hello.
Hi there. My name's Joan.
And I wanted to ask Peter a question. I don't know a lot about the Mary MacKillop and the sisters, but we go to Robe a lot, and the Star of the Sea Church is very close. We always look at that. However, my question is, I wondered how the order in the early days interacted with the local Aboriginal people, and do you know anything about that?
Not a lot about it. I think that Mary, in the Benola and what's her name, the town in Victoria that she came from, she did actually have connections with them there. And I know they taught Aboriginal students around the place, but I do not know a lot about whether they specifically targeted or worked with Aboriginal children. I think the story I do know is that when Governor Dominic Daly, a Catholic governor, sought to have his son taught by the Josephites at their school next to the cathedral, was there for a while, he wanted him separated from the rest of the kids, and she refused to have him. So she was pretty open, and I would assume that the boundaries, therefore, that many colonists would have had between Aboriginal kids and white kids were not there for the Josephites. But I don't know the answer to that properly, sorry.
PhD in that one too, huh? And there was a question just...
We just got one of it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, hi, my name's Isabel. The Bunyip features in a story I've written where the heroine was supposed to meet the Lady of the Lake, and the two cultures get mixed up. And I have been in the company of elders in the Northern Territory where they're telling the children bedtime stories about these little people that steal children away, and they disappear for 7 years and return later the same size as when they left. And the children take it all so seriously. And I said, well, that's one way of making sure they don't wander away from the campfire. And I really upset them because they read me as believing that was just a fairy tale. But it was a genuine belief. And I've just often wondered whether the Florians, further north, the little people, whether there's some anthropological echo in time down there.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. I really like your comments there, because I think we have such a default position when we hear Chukpara stories to think that there's a way of reasoning and rationalising them. And often when we do that, we start to shrink and conflate the complexities that are in there. And very often, you know, I've done quite a lot of work with horticulturalists. They will say, one instance is, I was working with Auntie Fran Bodkin, who's a Dharawal woman, and she works a lot. She's an ethnobotanist as well, very highly respected. And they will say, the horticulturalists, the non-First Nations one will say, you know, it's bloody amazing. Auntie Fran says all this stuff and we think she's a whacker, and then it turns out she's right about stuff. And it happens all the time. So I think this idea that we should just keep our ears open to these stories and treat them with that curiosity is absolutely right. Yeah, and just keep an open mind. You know, what I think Penny's story about the Bunyip shows us is that there was so much anxiety about trying to create meaning and categories in colonial society, and I think we still live in that mindset a little bit. There was a question over here. Yeah, just here, and then there's one at the front. Yep, thank you. Hello.
Hello, my name is Pat.
Hi, Pat.
I'm interested in how did Georgiana make contact with James Mangles in the beginning? So
Mangles's cousin was Ellen Mangles, who was the wife of the governor of Perth, and Mangles, I think, came out to Swan River 2 years after the Malloys, but they didn't make contact then. But he asked quite a few people in the colony to start collecting for him, and she was one of them. And so I think there were about 4 or 5 other people there. Yeah.
It doesn't seem that usual for women to be invited to do collecting. I've not heard of that in the tradition. So,
there's a fellow called Mueller, and he had a lot of women collecting for him. But botany was a way that women could do science without it being seen as unfeminine. And there's a lot of instances in Georgiana's letters where she says, oh, I know this plant comes from this particular area, and if I took the plant to England and told you all about it, I would be able to tell you absolutely everything about the plant. And then she adds, oh, I'm not saying this vauntingly. I'm just telling you because, it'll educate you. So as soon as she makes it known that she's a knowledgeable woman, she stands back because it wasn't feminine for women to be knowledgeable about these kinds of things.
And, a couple of questions at the front. We'll have this gentleman here on the first row, and I see you in the blue T-shirt. Can we... I think... Okay, blue T-shirt. There we are. Look at that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm from Scotland, where Halloween existed before the Americans discovered it. This is a general question. The intro was all about Halloween. Do any of the panel... The question is there anything out there, panel?
In researching the book that is being launched on the 14th of November at Dimmicks, called Wild Love, please come. That book, I was studying a lot of Scottish traditions. I was really interested in those traditions because the woman I was writing about is Australian born, but she had Scottish heritage. And I think that the Scots would insist that so many things are alive in this world. I was really taken by one thing I read, one Scottish tradition, which was when you go to a wild piece of land, before you civilise it, before you even set up a home or even a tent or anything like that, you have to go and talk to the wild spirits and ask them if they will let you be welcome there. And I guess that's my answer to that question, is that I think that there are rituals and traditions that allow for practices to take place that negotiate respect and possibility. So I'm not saying there is or there isn't, but I'm just saying possibility is a useful... having a... What was that mind? An agile mind, a reflective mind. That, to me, is what those scholars were saying when they were talking about true scepticism. 18th century scepticism was one that was alive to all possibilities. Anyone else want to answer the question?
I suppose I'm the religious one here, and I sort of am open to the idea of the spirits and ancestral spirits. There are two places I think of in South Australia. One is Hammond. Anyone ever been to the little town of Hammond? It's out on the plains and it has a sense of awe or something, almost an oppression in the air about it, which is quite amazing. The second one is actually quite different. It's the Aruna Valley. I was talking to a friend today who loves the Aruna Valley, and so do we. I went through there, hiked through there as a student in the early 70s, and I have love of it. But later I discovered that there was a massacre of Aboriginals there. 12 people died, slaughtered by the first white pastoralist, who was also a bully to whites. He was a nasty man. He went back to England just before the great drought of the 1860s, so he made his money and became rich while the next people got knocked out. I have no sense in that valley of the presence of that dark story. So it's interesting, isn't it, that some places do speak to us of something and others don't.
I just put one thing in there. One of the speakers that we were going to have tonight, who unfortunately couldn't be here because she had to go and tend to her mother in England, was Alison Oborne, who runs ghost tours of the Adelaide Jail. And I was so keen to bring that perspective in, both because it's a public history experience, but these kind of paranormal preoccupations that live both as tourism experiences, but I think as inquiries, as attempts to engage with those experiences where we go to places where the cultural memory is very heavy and thick somehow. And those of you who have been to the Adelaide Jail, I suspect many of you in the room might share my feeling that that's a very loaded place. Yeah. Did you want to...
Yeah, look, I think, just to respond to your query, I think that the cross-cultural imagination is a very powerful place, and I think I've spent a lot of my time writing and researching about Indigenous settler relations and cross-cultural interactions, that sort of liminal interface, you know. And I think, yes, Indigenous people are being colonised, but Europeans are becoming indigenised. And I think that is amazing, and I often dwell in that realm, and that is quite transformative too as a researcher, but also for the people that you're researching in the past. How amazing. You know, I would love to meet William Buckley. You know, he spent 30 years living with Wathawarong people around Port Phillip Bay, and how amazing. Imagine if you could interview him, and I think someone did, but imagine going and speaking to him, because he would be fluent in Wathawarong. I think that is pretty amazing. And I just wanted to respond to your comment about spirits and bunyips.
Culture. I mean, we've got the
Yeah.
weekend, very relaxed attitude. You know, Australians travel, we walk about the world.
Yeah.
You know, we're taking characteristics.
But I just wanted to respond to your earlier comment and say that apparently, I think it's Uncle Moogie Sumner says that the Mollyawonk or Bertha, the fake Bertha, the mechanical Bertha, that she's not scary enough. She needs to be much scarier. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that too. That plays that frisson of fear that has a legitimate place in these experiences too. And I think we've got room for one final question. Oh, okay. There's one at the back. Maybe we can fit two in. Let's see how we go. This very patient, generous man. Okay. Yes. Okay. Wow. It's all happening. Yes.
Sorry. Okay, my name's Gav. Just to give a bit of background, I'm the photographic archivist for the WEA. We've just celebrated our 110th anniversary last Sunday. Just two things. One, with the uncanny imagination, we talk about bunyips, but have you ever come across a yowie? That was the first question. For those who don't know what a yowie is, it's a mythical Bigfoot up in the Blue Mountains. And the second thing is, when we talk also about unimagined, or when we're using unimaginative, uncanny sense, I'm finding with some of the research we're doing, and I don't know whether or not this is right for this forum, but certainly with the history of WEA, we're finding stuff like back to the 1970s where women were suffering from BHS, which is bored housewife syndrome. Now, I'm just wondering whether or not we can actually bring these two, like with the history, it's connections. And I was just wondering, for me, it's not only the work that we do in terms of research, but it's also very emotional and very uplifting. I was just wondering, because of the amount of work you do, you just get so enthralled in it, and how do you cope with the pressures of making sure you get it right?
Bored wives, Cahalan syndrome, like hysteria. Are we talking about hysteria or something similar? Like, what are we talking about then?
There's a lot in that question.
Yeah.
I feel like you've invited us to sort of reflect on our own practice there, and and it seems like, yeah. Maybe this is a foyer conversation in some way, you know, where we could sit there and unpack it a little bit more. But what I do pick up is that you're wanting to introduce the emotions into this conversation, and that both boredom and frustration and other emotions play a really big part in creating, I guess, frissons that lead to different explorations as well. So thank you for that. Over to you, Marnie.
Marnie Hughes-Warrington. Penny really questioned, I thought of the House of the Gentle Bunyip in Melbourne, which was an Australian religion. So an ecumenical, I thought of Jill Rowe actually, when you were giving your talk. She wrote on Australian religions, and there was the House of the Gentle Bunyip. So there were bunyip religions in Australia. So for all of you, I know, I've got Jill's book. For all of you, just a question about the sacred. So for Jess in particular, whether that language you're seeing with Malloy has a sense of the sacred about it, whether there's an Australian sense of sacred in what all three of you were talking about.
I don't think Georgiana picked up on that, but I have. There's, going back to the previous conversations about massacres, Georgiana's husband was the resident magistrate and was the man of the law in that area. And the next door neighbours were the Bustles. And together they engineered a reprisal for a settler called George Lehman being killed, and he was on the land of the Wonnerup, the Wonnerup people, which is a bit south of Margaret River. Thank you. And Sam Carmody has written, done a ABC series about this, and he's a descendant of the Bustles, and he's suffered from depression. And our colleague Benita Mason has written about this. And I wrote an essay about that on what I found in the archives, and the event had been covered up and covered up and covered up at the time and subsequently in history. And Sam used that as part of his research. And so I was trying to find out what was Georgiana doing at that time, and there was no mention. But what she was trying to do was find this plant called the Niotsia floribunda, which is a parasite. And so she could never get it to grow, and the seeds are really, really small. And all she said at that time was that I cannot bear to contemplate what has happened. I went out searching for the seeds of Niotsia floribunda. But that plant for Noongar people is where the souls of the dead stay in the tree before they go on to the afterlife. And I thought that is the creepiest thing I have ever heard in terms of like this colonial project of collecting. So there was something sacred happening there, and this whole colonial project was trying to contain it. And that has only come out in the last year of the project. And yeah, and what we were talking about earlier about in terms of being affected by the agency of the plant world, that is definitely there too. So I think it's there, and it's affecting me as a writer. And that's the kind of thing I'm putting in the book as well, yeah.
Two almost equal, opposite comments. A German student with the History Trust years ago said, South Australians have got a much stronger sense of history than we Germans. And I said, what do you mean? I said, it's so much bigger there. And he said, that is the problem. The human figure is much smaller in German history. You go into a country town and you'll see a red telephone box, and you'll talk to people and say, see that building, my grandparents built that. So that's, history is immanent. History is sacred space that's immanent around us, natural. On the other hand, it amazes me whenever I talk often to people doing local history, they've gone into an archives and blasted the most boring bloody facts they can find because they think that if you research it out of the archives, it's got to be sacred gold. Whereas in fact, much of the best stories about the town are told in the pub, in their life. I remember talking to Warren Farger at Wirri Upper Station once, and I said, do people talk to you about the history of this really amazing sort of heritage pastoral station? And he said, oh yeah, they want to know how we live around here. Notice how he segued actually from history to what people are interested in as visitors, which is 100% visitors are interested in the present and how the culture of this place is now, and then they build back into how it was shaped. Got me? So history is immanent, is there, but also this kind of sacralisation of history as, oh, it's bigger than me, you wouldn't be interested in me, is the up-down stuff that I think still plays in people's heads.
Penny, the sacred. I feel I would love you to talk about your lyrebird, but it might not come into this answer. Anyway.
Gosh. When we think of the sacred, perhaps we think of a kind of Judeo-Christian idea or a European idea of the sacred, but I think there is the numinous, and I think that those things that is within, objects and relics, and that can transport you into different worlds. So one of the quotes I love, which I say too much, but when you use objects as the starting point of history, and this is from Delia Falconer, the writer, it can take you into the back door of history, and you can come out of the front door into a different house. And I do think there's a transportive aspect to material culture or plants or... I've been thinking about wearing the brown wool
the brown wool in the heat. You know, I think there's a transportive aspect that is, you know, otherworldly and can take you to different places. There's my answer.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this one too, because I've been thinking about this kind of question a lot. It's such a beautiful question, Marnie. Thank you. Is, you know, in writing my book about Adelaide Ironside, I was so struck by her talking about her own enthusiasm for the invisible. And she constantly is communing with flowers and having some sort of very elevated moment. She uses that kind of language. She talks about the universal fire. You know, she writes mystical poetry. So we are so used to turning 19th century mystical experiences into either these people having awful experiences of religions being imposed on them and constraining them, or fraudulent spiritualists. But it's just not statistically possible that the majority of 19th century people were having those. And I think a lot of people that came to Australia in the late 18th, early 19th century were pushing away from religious experiences, so intent upon having their own moments of revelation, of elation, of ecstasy. And they're really informed by German Romanticism and Scottish transcendentalism and American transcendentalism. All those things are in our zeitgeist today. They're part of the way that we smile at each other, I think, as Australians. Those moments of connection where we look at each other eye to eye, they're moments of connections that are part of the sacred, I would say. And on that note, I think we should look at each other eye to eye. And I would like to thank you for what I think has been a secular, non-dogmatic, and perhaps occasionally sacred experience here. So thank you very much. To wrap up, we need to acknowledge that behind the scenes and just being such a joyous force in the Talking History team is wonderful Suze Redmond and Whitney Boyd behind us, the team from Channel 44, the team from UniSA who have been working with us. They're a fabulous partner. I hope you've enjoyed this location and all the support from UniSA, and that you'll come back next year. Don't forget to chew my ears off with some ideas about speakers and stories for next year. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you'll join me now to thank our three most fabulous speakers.